short vort on Parshas Emor. So the beginning of Parshas Emor says, "Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Emor el Kahanim b'nei Aaron v'amarta alechem v'lenefesh lo gitmo be'amav." Hashem said to Moshe, "Speak to the Kahanim, the sons of Aaron, and you shall say to them, let him not defile himself with the dead among his people." So the beginning of this week's Parsha, as we just mentioned, talks about Kohanim and their responsibility to not become tameh, to not become impure through contact with the dead body. Now Rashi brings down a commentary from the Talmud, and he says, Emor el Kahanim, Emor ve'amarta, la'achzir gedolim al katan. Say unto the priests, and thou shalt say unto them, say, and again thou shalt say unto them. This repetition is intended to admonish the adults about their children also, that they should teach them to avoid defilement. So Rashi, quoting from the Talmud, says that there is a message hidden in our verse that means that the Gedolim, meaning the Kohanim above the age of 13 years old, have a special responsibility to train and teach the laws of ritual defilement to the Kohanim that are below the age of 13 years old. Now, if you scan the verse, Moshe Feinstein asks a very logical question based on what we just read, which is that the verse itself does not mention anything about any distinctions between Kohanim below the age of 13, above the age of 13. Where does the Talmud, where does Rashi get this idea that a person is supposed to teach the younger Kohanim the laws of defilement from this verse? Read the verse to yourself. Read it over and over again in Hebrew and English. There's no logical mention about anything about children, Ketanim, below the age of 13. It just sounds like what it sounds like, that it's talking to older Kohanim. So where do we see that there's anything to do with older Kohanim teaching younger Kohanim and training them in Chinuch? So we learned from this week's Parsha a very important lesson. So I'm going to divert first with a small incident that I remember in my life. I remember there was a girl that I knew, and she was actually being interviewed, and I watched her being interviewed, and she was telling somebody about how much she appreciates and loves Orthodox Judaism. That anytime she goes to the synagogue, which is not that often, and anytime she does a mitzvah, she does it in the Orthodox Jewish way. Now, she herself does not live a fully Orthodox life, but she said that when I have children, I will send them to Orthodox day schools. I'll make them keep kosher. I'll make them keep Shabbos, because here's the thing. It's too hard on me. I was born not Orthodox, so it would be too hard for me to change my lifestyle. But my children, they're like blank canvases, and so it won't be too hard for them to grow up as Orthodox Judaism. Now, you have to think that that is a very flawed way of thinking. Why? Because children learn by example, as we know. And if they see you acting like a hypocrite, and they see that it's too hard of a life for you, then especially we see that children are weaker and weaker as the generations pass. So how on earth are they going to keep such a lifestyle if you don't keep it yourself? They'll call you out as a hypocrite. So this is a message that's contained in this week's Parsha. Moshe Feinstein says, you are right. There is no explicit mentioning to the children in this week's Parsha. Look at the verse. It doesn't mention little kids in this week's Parsha. But we know that grammatically in Hebrew, when a verb is repeated, it is repeated for extra emphasis, right? So for example, anytime you see like most you must, the art scroll, like meaning you shall surely die, like the word die repeated 2 times, the art scroll translation will always say you shall surely die, or you shall surely put to death. It doesn't just say you should put to death, you shall surely. So over here in this verse, we do have this similar type of repetition, Emor ve'amarta. And so what Moshe Feinstein is saying here is that this verse is giving an emphasis, which means you, the older Kohanim, the parents of younger Kohanim, have a mitzvah to be extremely careful with the laws of ritual defilement. And to the point that you are so careful that it will rub off onto your children. What does that mean? Meaning, it doesn't have to mention the children explicitly. You won't have to say anything to your children. Meaning that you are so careful with the laws of defilement, and your children see how careful you are, that they realize that it is something that you treat very seriously and something that you take very seriously and care a lot about, and so much that it rubs off onto them. So, Moshe says, yes, this is a reference to the children, but it's a reference to the children through osmosis. That's why the children aren't mentioned explicitly. It is be extremely careful, the sons of Aaron, meaning you older Kohanim, with the laws of impurity to the point, and this is the implication, to the point that it rubs off on other people. So through keeping the Torah and keeping it, also Ramosha says besimcha and with the didukim, it rubs off and creates an environment that gets the children to see how precious our Torah is. If they see their parents so, like, I think Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel writes about his uncle, that he saw his uncle at night take his hand and rub it across the books on the shelf and then kiss his hand, right? That's like when children see such a thing like that, that rubs off as osmosis. So that is what we learn at the beginning of this week's Parsha.